bulletins and your prayer lists. I want to go over just a few announcements. The midweek Bible study and prayer meeting is this Wednesday, 7 p.m. And then the Waymar Bible study, it's 10 a.m. in the bulletin. You can come at 10, we'll be there. But come at 10:30 is when it starts. That's down here at the Waymar housing. So come on down there and be a part of that. We're going to continue in our book that we started, it seems about 10 years ago. But we're going to get back into that and continue on in it. Deacons meeting coming up on June 10th. And then the men's prayer breakfast here at the church on June 13th. That's a Saturday morning here at the church at 7 a.m. And looking forward to that. Also, you see in there about the new prayer list that's coming out for June. If you have any updates or you have any new requests that need to get added, you can update me here this evening during our prayer request time, or you can write it on one of the prayer request slips. Text me, call me, email me, however you'd like to, but that's going to be coming out next week. All right, take out your prayer lists, and we will go over a few things here. Okay. Let's see here. We've got Debbie Lopez, Tammy McEldowney. Both are doing well. Debbie Lopez just had massive surgery as she is working on recovering from breast cancer. If you would continue to pray for her. She has had just a tremendously long road, but seems to have turned the corner and is doing well. Tammy McEldowney also did very, very intense chemo treatments for cancer, and just in the last, I think 2 weeks ago, had surgery, so is recovering from surgery. Continue to pray for them. I know they would appreciate that. Pray for Pastor Wolf as he is down there at the Sunrise Terrace Rehab Center. Be praying for him. He had a seizure back this past week, and we just need to pray for him. That is common for folks who are recovering from a stroke, but that doesn't make it any less scary when it's happening. So if you would pray for Pastor Wolf. Any further update on him as far as...
We had another one this morning with a fellow in a wheelchair the other day. Picked something up on the floor. But he didn't hurt himself.
Okay. So we just need extra prayer for Pastor Wolf for protection right now, and that these seizures, he's on medication for them, right? So let's pray that those will be brought under control here very, very soon. That is a scary time. Looking here, Mark Turner has knee replacement surgery coming up on June 5th. Need to be praying for him. Jerry Imhoff heading up to the Mayo Clinic to try to get some answers regarding his heart issues. He's heading up there on Tuesday, so if you would pray for safety and travel for them, and then also that the Mayo Clinic would be able to find some answers for him. That would be a blessing, I know. Jerry Owen, diagnosed with cancer here recently. Let's keep them in our prayers. And then I mentioned this morning, we just need to pray for our nation right now. We're living in some pretty dark times, and we need to pray that the Lord would be exalted and lifted up in these times, and pray that as a nation that we'll humble ourselves and seek His face. That's what we need to do. So, any other prayer requests, updates? Yes, ma'am.
Joni Hybert, and it's Hybert, not Haber.
Yes.
Is undergoing some severe pain that is not diagnosed yet, and it's very vague, and she's trying to seek answers for that, but has none yet.
Okay.
Severe pain.
Let's be praying for Joni Hybert. She is undergoing some different issues right now. I've talked with her a little bit, and it's been rough. She's had a long time of it. So let's be praying for her. Someone else, prayer request or an update? Yes.
I think Burr has an appointment this week.
Okay.
We decided if we should go ahead with the surgery or not.
Okay. So let's be praying for. Let's be praying for a myrrh. Someone else.
My Aunt Darlene, I think it's this week is her eye appointment where she finds out more about her prognosis.
Okay. Darlene Walker on the front there under health needs. Her appointment this week, probably, we think, for getting some answers about the health needs that she has. So let's be praying for her. Someone else? Good to have the Wakehoffs as our guests here this evening and this morning, so be sure you make them feel welcome. It's a blessing to have guests with us anytime. Make sure you make them feel at home. Anyone else? I'm doing something this evening that I have never done in the pulpit. I forgot my pen, and I pulled this out from under the podium, and they were giving them away in children's church, and it's an invisible ink pen. So you have to shine the light on the page to see what I wrote. So it'll be exciting when I get home and interpret my notes as to what I have written. But I think I've got everything, actually, but never done that before. Hope to never do it again, to be perfectly honest with you. All right, I'm going to ask Barry, if you would lead us in prayer for these different needs that we have that have been mentioned, as many of them as you're able to, and then we'll carry on in our worship here this evening.
Thank you, Lord, for blessing us with this church. Thank you, Lord, for blessing us with the pastor and his wife and family. Thank you, Lord, for salvation of those who receive Jesus. Lord, we have many people that we are concerned about in our families. And Lord, we know that you are able to carry us through. And when things are rough and things look cloudy, we can't see through the problems, Lord, we know that you are able to. Lord, you are able to see and know and answer and do according to your will. And we want to throw all these things, Lord, at you, according to your will be done, and ask your blessing upon each one of them, each one of their family members. Lord, we pray for Helen and Jerry, for the physical issues that Jerry has. We pray, Lord, that the doctor would be able to see through the things that they haven't been able to find here, and an ongoing situation for Jerry. So we just pray, Lord, that the doctor would be able to see the issue and help him gain some, with their knowledge, gain some knowledge on how to best doctor him. So we just pray for Jerry and Mom today. We pray for Jerry and Rita. I believe they live down in Arkansas now. And we pray for them as Jerry has complications with some cancer. We pray, Lord, thank you, Lord, for all their service. They've Rio Grande Islands to traveling from place to place, working, Lord, wherever you have sent them, and missionaries of sorts. So we just pray for Jerry and Rita. Let you care for them. Help them along the way. We pray, Lord, for even their daughter, Kim Mays, who I believe is living in there too. Her husband passed away as a missionary. And so we pray for her too. We ask your guidance and direction for Yoni Hyper. She's got some pain right now. We just pray for her and Dan as the doctors figure and search and look what they can find for her. We'll lift her up this evening too. We pray, Lord, for and have your blessing upon our dear Pastor Wolf for many years of service that he has given here to the church and to many others around the community. For him and Kathy, lift them up and strengthen them. Give Pastor Wolf some strength in his arms and legs so he can have the ability to come home. We'd like to see that as an answered prayer, Lord. So just lift Pastor Wolf up soon. We work on the bathroom, getting it, some of the other issues there in the house, get it ready so we can come home and we can effectively help him with the therapy, maybe do better at home than maybe at the care center. A lot more comfortable there, and so we pray for that strength for Kathy also. We pray for Amor, who has had some issues here for the whole past year, working at the school, and then was off for many months, and now is looking at an appointment for whatever it is. I don't know for sure what the appointment is for, but be it him and Holly as they go to the doctor, as they talk back and forth with him, and they make some good decisions there also. Lord, thank you, Lord, for the Turner family. Pray for Mark as he has his knee surgery this week. And on the 5th, I believe, and that'll all go well. We know he's had some other issues with prayers to that family. Pray the Lord for this answer also for him and wife, Sue. Lord, we are thankful and grateful for the prophecy ministry that going through the study of the book of the children of Israel. As we have, for the past many weeks, we look now towards looking into the prophecy that you have for the future. We know that everything is held in your hands. So we ask your guidance and direction on our country. Lord, we in China and Korea. We know that China is after Korea now, trying to take that country over. And Lord, that many things happening around the world, and Lord, we're glad that we are safely in your hands, and we ask your guiding direction on this church to go forward. Help us and bless us. Pray for our lost loved ones and for salvation, Lord, until you come. We know that it could be today. And so we pray for the ones who have put off salvation. Lord, have your Holy Spirit work in the hearts and lives of the men and women that we all are praying for each and every day, for family and friends and loved ones. Guide us now this evening as we fellowship. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Pastor,
Yes, sir.
Paul's got a couple of appointments this week, and I'm having a procedure on Wednesday.
Okay.
I was a guest over the last weekend, a couple of nights I was a guest up there. They asked me to come back.
Oh, okay. Well, let's be praying for Diana and for John. That's different appointments this week. So let's be praying. Early in the week, later in the week, or all throughout?
Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday.
Well, sounds like a busy start to the week for John and Diana. Let's be praying for them. The Lord will bless there. So add that to your sheets. All right, let's sing 184 in light of what we were just praying for, day by day. You can stay seated as we sing. Tremendous song of testimony. Pay attention to the words as we sing 184. Day by day, and with each passing moment, strength I find to meet my trials here. Trusting in my Father's wise bestowment, I've no cause for worry or for fear. He whose heart is kind beyond all measure gives unto each day what he deems best. Loving me for with pain and pleasure, mingling toil with peace and rest. Every day the Lord himself is near me, with a special mercy for each hour. All my cares he fain would bear and cheer me, he whose name is Counselor and God. The protection of his job and treasure is the charge that on himself he laid. As thy days, thy strength shall be in measure, is the pledge to me made. Help me then in every tribulation, so to trust thy promises, O Lord, that I lose the faith's sweet consolation offered me within thy holy word. Help me, Lord, when toil and trouble meeting, there to take as from a Father's hand, one by one, thy faithful moments fleeting, till I reach the promised land. So many phrases in that song that are a tremendous blessing. We're going to sing 380 before we go into our study of Israel's history tonight. 380, why don't you stand with me? We'll sing the first, the second, and the last verse, Oh, Worship the King. Oh, worship the King, all glorious above, and gratefully sing His wonderful love, our shield and defender, the ancient of days, and girded with praise. Oh, tell of His might, oh, sing of His grace, whose throne is the light, whose canopies face, His chariots of wrath, the deep thunder clouds flow, and dark is His path on the wings of the storm. And the last, frail children of dust, and feeble as frail, in Thee do we trust, nor find Thee to fail. Thy mercies how tender, how firm to the end, our Maker, Defender, Redeemer, and Friend. You can be seated. All right, we are beginning to wrap up our study here in Israel's history, and won't be long. As Barry mentioned as he was praying, our goal is we'll finish up the history of Israel. We're going to bring it into the modern day when we'll discuss the current events, and then we will transition from present day into future prophecy, and we'll be looking through Daniel, Revelation, and some of the prophets as we just kind of unpack the prophecy that we find in God's Word. If you haven't picked up on it, if you've been here for any of our series, especially in the more recent history, you've probably picked up that I'm biased when it comes to this whole study. I would be unapologetically biased in the direction of Israel. I make no apologies for that. I would say I'm not prejudiced. To be prejudiced means that you prejudge. I'm not prejudging, but we are called to judge, and as we look at history, history leads us towards a particular bias. It leads us in a particular direction, and so I make no apology for the fact that I'm giving you this information that we have been giving up till now with a distinct bias in the direction of the Jews, God's chosen people. They're not perfect. They've done some terrible things, to be perfectly honest, over the years. There have been massacres of civilians that the Jews have been responsible for. But they are God's chosen people. God has His hand on them, and I trust that as we've been going through these studies, I hope that you've seen that God is not done with Israel. God is not done with Israel on a national scale. Now, right now, the focus of God's attention is who? Gentiles. More specifically, how is God reaching the world today?
Church.
The church, right? You and me. Okay? In the Old Testament, how was God reaching the world? Israel, His peculiar people, right? That's why He gave them the law, so that they would stand out and so that they could point others towards the coming Messiah. But when Jesus came, the Jews rejected Jesus Christ. And so following the death of Christ, God turned His attention from the Jews to the church. But that's not to say that He set aside Israel, never to deal with them again. When the rapture takes place, the church will be gone. And where do you think God's focus is going to return? Israel. Okay, so it's coming again. So we're dealing with what's going on because I feel that it's very, very important. It puts the news that you see in perspective. It puts the events that many of you have lived through into perspective. Everything that has happened from the very beginning with the sons of Shem and the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob up until 2020 fits into the plan of God, and it fits perfectly. And so that is important. This This evening we're going to be covering a period of history. Again, we're into where some of you were born, and we'll be into where most of you were born by the end of the evening.
Pastor,
Yes.
since we're getting into this, this brings to mind, we constantly hear about World War II veterans, but Israel went through a pretty trying time
Oh, yes.
about that same time. Do we have any idea how many Jews were actually slaughtered, or how many Jews may be still alive went through this?
There were 6 to 6.5 million who were murdered during the Holocaust. As far as the number that we have that made it out of the Holocaust, I don't have a number. I'm sure that somewhere in genealogical records you could find something. The Jews who inhabited Israel, but I don't have that number right off the top of my head. They are quickly decreasing, as are the World War II veterans, unfortunately. So
Isn't today the day of Pentecost?
today is the day of Pentecost, which Pentecost means what? You know?
Church.
Means what? When the birth of the church. Penti means 5. Pentecost is 50 days after Passover. So Pentecost happens every year, 50 days after Passover, which happens according to the lunar cycle. Remember, the Jewish holiday and the Jewish calendar runs on a lunar cycle, whereas we, Gentiles, most of us run on a Gregorian or Roman calendar. We run by the sun. The Jews run by the moon. And so that's how it works. But Pentecost, 50 days after Passover, happens every year, but it is the birthday of the church. So kind of a neat day. All right, last week we dealt with a period of time between 1882 and 1948. We began with the Ottoman Empire in control of the land of Israel. This is the beginning of last week. The Ottoman Empire was one of the 4 empires that passed out of existence during the course of World War II. Yes, sir?
I got a question. All right, does the green mean something? Is it relevant to something, the coloring of it?
Yes, the green is the Ottoman Empire.
Okay.
So at the time of World War II, when it was fought, everything that you see up there that's green was under the control of the Ottoman Turks.
So if there's a green area, that's what's controlled by?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So everything that you see there, pretty wide swath of territory. If you get right down to it, the Ottomans control.
Don't we got a green area here in Iowa?
No, that's
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
little bit different, but yeah.
Just checking.
Yep.
Okay,
So the Ottoman Empire passes out of existence at the end of World War I, never to return. And following the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the British were given oversight of Palestine. It was called the British Mandate of Palestine. World War II started and brought with it the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews, 6.5, something in there, million Jews were murdered by the Nazis. The Jews were fleeing Europe, trying to get into any country that would have them, but they were turned away from the different countries of the world, America included, and they were sent back into Europe, where they were sent into the Nazi camps, where many of them perished. Following the end of World War II in Europe, many of the Jews that survived tried to get into Palestine, but they were limited. If you remember, and I'm not going to go through last week, you remember the British White Papers limited Jewish immigration into the land of Palestine at 1,500 Jews per month. At the time during World War II, when the Holocaust was going on, the Nazis were killing 15,000 Jews per day. Okay? So the numbers were not even close. 1,500 is a drop in the bucket compared to what the Nazis were killing in the German-controlled Reich. So they're trying to get in, but they're limited by the British, by the White Papers. Following many years of attack, you remember we talked last week about Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin started the Irgun, which was a guerrilla warfare unit of Jews who were fighting against the British in the British-controlled Palestine. After many different instances of what was considered by the British and by the World Court at that time, terrorism, the British people finally decided, we've had enough. Forget this. We're going to give the control, we are giving the responsibility of the land of Palestine back to the United Nations. It was given to them when the United Nations was called the League of Nations, right before World War I, right after World War I. When World War II ended, they gave it back to the United Nations. In 1947, the United Nations voted to partition or to set aside a portion of the land of Palestine for a Jewish state within the land. And on May 14th, 1948, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion stood up and declared the nation of Israel as a free and sovereign state among the nations of the world. Okay, and you see he's standing there under the picture of Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl was the father of modern Zionism. Okay, so this is all review, bringing us up to what we have talked about up to last week. Now, I'm going to have, my wife is running my slides tonight, she's going to put a slide up here of a map. You see this map? Is everybody able to see it fairly well? Okay. I'm going to just explain very briefly because this map is going to come up again and again and again. You see the area of bright yellow? That is the land that was controlled by the Jews. That was Israel in 1948. That very odd-shaped portion of land, very thin. It's 9 miles across at its thinnest point. That's not wide for a nation. Okay? You see up at the top, you see the darker yellow or the gold, and it's labeled the Golan Heights. We'll be dealing with that extensively. Just below that, you see the portion called the West Bank. Why do you figure it's called the West Bank? It's on the west side of the Jordan River, yes. So it would be, in biblical terms, it would be the area of Judea, Samaria. Okay, that's what the West Bank is considered. And you see kind of jutting out into the West Bank, do you see Jerusalem? Okay, the capital city, as we'll deal with in just a few moments. And then the last area, or well, almost the last area, you see right here, you see Gaza City, and you see in the corner, you see the Gaza Strip. Okay, that is what would have been considered old Philistia, where, can you think of any great big person who came out of there? Goliath came out of the Gaza Strip. And so that's what that is. Now, here's what I'm going to do. Everybody take your right hand and do just like that. Okay? Point it towards you. Okay? Here's how it works. This right here is how the map works. Okay? You've got the Red Sea is in two portions. Your middle finger, if you're looking at your hand towards you, would be the Gulf of the Red Sea. And your pointer finger would be what is called the Gulf of Aqaba. Okay? And the area of land in between is called the Sinai Peninsula. Okay? So when you are trying to remember, as we will talk about the Sinai, we'll have it on some maps, but that's what it looks like. You have the Red Sea coming up in two fingers, the Gulf of the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, let's go and let's talk about the War of Independence. You remember I kind of left you on a cliffhanger the last time. They declared their independence on May 14th, and the day after, on May 15th, they were attacked by 6 Arab nations that surrounded them. The nations that attacked them were the nations of Egypt, Transjordan, which would eventually become Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Okay, so they are attacking, and they're coming up. You also see on there, Oman is on there. They were a more minor player. Okay? The fledgling nation of Israel was attacked by these 6 more populated, better armed, and better trained armies than they were. The goal of this 6-army confederation, the Palestinian Liberation Army, was to drive the Jews out of the land of Palestine and into the Mediterranean. We'll kill all of them. And if you remember, last week I mentioned that before 1948, she would eventually be Prime Minister. Golda Meir went to the United States seeking financial support for the Israeli people as they were trying to get funds in order to buy arms, because they knew that as soon as they declared themselves independent, they would be attacked. And so they sent Golda Meir, who had been a school teacher in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for quite a while. They sent her back to America to raise funds. You remember the first night that she did her fundraiser, she raised $60 million in 1948. That's a lot of money in 2020, and it's a whole lot of money in 1948. Israel had been able to gather some surplus army supplies. A lot of the rifles that the Jews fought this war with were Lee Enfield rifles, which were used in, any of you gun people would know, that was the main weapon of the British in World War I. So they were using old technology to fight this war. After World War II had ended in 1945, the world was awash in surplus military gear. And so the Jews were able to go and buy that. But even with all of these supplies, Israel was still incredibly outgunned and incredibly outmanned. The army that was coming against them vastly outnumbered them. One thing that the nation of Israel also needed desperately at this time on May 15th was they needed to be recognized as a nation by the other nations of the world. It's one thing to declare yourself a nation on paper. It's quite another thing to be recognized as a sovereign nation by other nations. The President of the United States at the time was Harry Truman. Harry Truman came into office through less than desirable circumstances. You remember whose vice president he was? FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, died in his 4th term in office, and his vice president, Harry Truman, came into office. Harry Truman was under tremendous pressure from his advisors to not recognize the state of Israel for several reasons. One, it will jeopardize our relationship with the Arab oil industry. America at the time was getting much of our oil from the Arabs, and they said, Harry, don't recognize Israel. If you do, you'll jeopardize our oil supply. It would also antagonize the Arab populations of the world. And so they said, don't do it. And they also told Harry Truman that if you recognize this state of Israel, and then tomorrow or next week they get wiped off the face of the map and driven into the Mediterranean, then the United States will get a diplomatic black eye because we acknowledge the existence of the state of Israel, and now there is no state of Israel because the Arabs wiped them off the face of the map. One of the most outspoken against recognizing Israel was Secretary of State at the time, George C. Marshall. If you're familiar with the Marshall Plan that happened during the Korean War, that was this man. He was the Secretary of State under President Truman. But we serve a sovereign God, don't we? You're familiar with the story of Esther, where Esther says, where Mordecai tells Esther, he says, perhaps you've come into the kingdom for such a time as this. Well, there's a kind of an Esther moment here in the life of Harry Truman. Before he went into politics, Harry Truman had a men's clothing warehouse in Kansas City, Missouri, that he ran with his business partner, who he had grown up with. They had been friends since childhood. They had fought in World War I together, and then they had come back, started this business. The friend's name was Eddie Jacobson, and he was a Jew. He was a friend of Harry Truman, not involved in politics in and of itself. But when it was obvious that Israel was going to declare themselves to be a nation, everybody, all of the Jewish hierarchy, all of those who were in the Jewish government, were trying to get a meeting with President Truman. And Truman would not meet with them. He said, I'm not going to face this decision right now. And so, someone who was on the side of the Jewish nation remembered that President Truman had a childhood friend named Eddie Jacobson, and he was a Jew. And so they went, they found Eddie Jacobson, and they brought him into the White House, and Eddie was able to get a meeting, a face-to-face meeting with his old friend Harry. And so they sat down, and when they got into the Oval Office, President Truman looked across the table at Eddie Jacobson and said, we can talk about anything, but we can't talk about Israel. And Eddie Jacobson bowed his head and began to cry in the Oval Office. And President Truman looked at him and said, what are you crying for? And he was crying because he knew what was going to come. And he actually pointed at a picture. You can read about this if you do your own research. He pointed at a picture of Andrew Jackson that Truman had hanging in the Oval Office. And he said, who is this? Truman said, that's my hero, Andrew Jackson. Eddie Jacobson said, well, I have a hero too. His name is Haim Weizmann, who was then the president of the Jewish nation. And he said, Harry, I want you to meet with Haim Weizmann. And guess what? as a favor to his old friend who he had run a clothing warehouse with, President Truman saw Haim Weizmann, and President Truman decided against almost all of his advisors that the United States of America would recognize the state of Israel as a free and sovereign nation among the nations of the world. And as a result of that, the United States have seen the blessing of God poured out on our country like no other on the face of God's green earth. And it's a testament to the sovereignty of God that God would have a Jewish young man named Eddie Jacobson grow up with Harry Truman and would eventually be able to get to a face-to-face meeting when no one else could. So, the United States recognizes Israel. Israel goes into war. Israel had done all she could to prepare for the inevitable war, but they were unable to secure much of an air force to speak up, because you could get Willys Jeeps, you could get machine guns, you could get grenades and bazookas, but planes were hard to come by at the end of World War II. But an American pilot named Lou Lenart made his services available to Israel as a fighter pilot. And he and a few Israeli pilots went to Czechoslovakia, which existed at the time, to pick up 6 Czechoslovakian surplus aircraft. Now, if you're into World War II history, maybe you're familiar with some of the planes, and maybe you could name some of them, the B-17, the B-52, the P-51, but you probably can't name any Czechoslovakian aircraft. And the reason why? They stunk. They were not good aircraft. As a matter of fact, Leonard later described these less than dependable planes as a farm tractor motor inside a Lamborghini. They were not dependable. Actually, they were bringing 6 from Czechoslovakia to Israel. They lost 2 on the trip. Okay? So when you lose a third of your Air Force transferring it from one place to another, not under combat conditions, that's not good. But that's what happened. They made it to Israel, the 4 planes, and Israel's under attack. The Egyptian army has planes, tanks, and artillery, and they're attacking. They're coming up. Israel would be over here, and Israel is coming up, and they're advancing up the Gaza Strip. At the top of the Gaza Strip, there's a little kibbutz. It's called Yad Mordechai. And there's a lot of books that are written about Yad Mordechai. If you're interested, I can lend you one of them. But the Egyptian army is coming up on this little kibbutz above the Gaza Strip. And there are 3 battalions of Egyptian soldiers, and they're fighting 140 farmers. 140 farmers held off 3 battalions of Egyptian soldiers for 6 days, which is saying something, because they didn't have anything to fight with. They ran out of ammo for a lot of their weapons. Pretty amazing stuff. Yad Mordechai held their ground before they were captured, and the Egyptians continued on up on their route to Tel Aviv. With the 4 remaining fighter pilots, with Lou Lenart, these undependable Czechoslovakian aircraft finally got up in the air. And these 4 men attacked the Egyptian army. 4 planes, 6,000 Egyptians who have planes, tanks, trucks, and everything, and you have 4 planes that attack. They destroyed a bridge that was 17 miles below Tel Aviv, and that bridge was what the Egyptian army had been going to use to get to Tel Aviv. And so 4 planes, one of them was actually destroyed by the 6,000 soldiers who were shooting at it. 3 planes destroyed the bridge and prevented the Egyptian army from rebuilding it on the way as they were trying to get to Tel Aviv. And so they were able to keep it. Finally, these planes got up in the air again with little bombs. They were able to put 1 70-kilogram bomb. If you know much about bombs, that's not a big bomb. That's 154 pounds. So it weighed less than me, and they dropped this little bomb, but they got it into just the right spot where there were a bunch of Egyptian tanks, trucks, and troops who had gathered together. They blew it up, and the entire Egyptian army stopped. 1 154-pound bomb stopped 6,000 Egyptians on their way to Tel Aviv. And they stopped. Pretty amazing stuff. Coincidence, right? Yeah. We serve a great God, don't we? Moshe Dayan, maybe you're familiar with him. You remember seeing him? The guy with the patch. I think he looked cool. I remember when I was little, I used to put on a patch so I could look like him. He would hold a lot of different positions during the War for Independence, but among his first was he took some of the weapons that Golda Meir had been able to acquire with the money, and he took some machine guns and he attached them to jeeps and drove out into the Negev. And he also, so you have the Egyptians stopped there below Tel Aviv, and now you have Moshe Dayan, who's also attacking the rear column, and he was able to do some pretty amazing things there in the desert with just a few jeeps with machine guns strapped to them. After this, Moshe Dayan was placed in charge of the defense of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was declared Israel's capital from the beginning, from 1948. If you're keeping track of the news, it was declared to be so in 2018 by the United States. So we're a little bit behind the times on that. So that's dealing with the south, the Egyptians coming up through the south. In the north, in the Galilee, the Syrians and the Iraqis were advancing toward the Jordan Valley. Another kibbutz, or communal farm called Degania Aleph, lay in their path. The Degania Aleph had 2 teenagers, and they were all out of ammo. They didn't have anything else to do. And the Syrian and Iraqi tanks were pouring it through a small pass. And so in the middle of the night, 2 teenagers got homemade bombs. You know what a Molotov cocktail is? A glass bottle filled with gas with a fuse stuck in it. They threw 2. These 2 teenagers took out 2 tanks. And guess what the Syrian and Iraqi armies did? Stopped. Doesn't make sense, does it? But it's what happened. And so, lots of other, we could go into, if you had more time, we could go into much, there are lots and lots more stories associated with Israel's war for independence. Who won the war? Well, Israel won. Who really won the war? God won the war. 2 teenagers taking out the Syrian and Iraqi tank divisions? Really? 3 ramshackle Czechoslovakian planes took out the Egyptian army? That's God. And it's just got God's hand. Just like God made Gideon victorious over his enemies, God made the Israelis victorious over theirs at this time as well. Israel survived against overwhelming odds, and they began to sink roots into the land fast and deep. So they won the 1948-1949 War for Independence. Now, I want to take just a moment and I want to talk to you about the refugee situation. How many of you remember when the refugee situation was much more of a big deal in the American news cycle than it is right now? It used to be, I remember, about the Palestinian refugees and the PLO and everything that went into that. Before 1948, the Palestinians, Jews and Arabs, had lived together in the land of Israel, or the land of Palestine, on mostly good terms. They got along well. They were good neighbors. They were fine. There was no problem between the Jews and the Arabs in that time. But what happened in 1948, when it became evident to the Arab leaders that Israel was going to declare independence, they told the Palestinian Arabs who lived in the land of Israel, get out. Get out, because our armies are going to sweep through, and here's what you need to do. If you will leave, we'll sweep the Jews into the Mediterranean. In about a week, you can come back, you can have your land, and you can have their land. But that's not what happened. As we already read, the Arabs didn't win in this instance. They got stopped by the sovereign hand of God. And so you have all of these Arabs who've now been displaced. Some by choice, many by choice, and some because they were refugees from war, as is the case in any war. They left. And so, you see on the map before you that Israel is surrounded by 22 Islamic nations. They have 60 times her population. What could happen to the refugee crisis? They could be absorbed into those 22 nations, couldn't they? It is by choice that they are not. The refugee crisis, if you remember when we heard about it a whole lot more in the late 80s and early 90s, the reason why it is an issue at all is because the Arab nations, the Muslim nations, needed the refugees as bargaining chips. They are human pawns in a game of public opinion. The wicked Jews have driven the Arabs out of their homeland. That's not entirely true. Many of the Arabs decided to leave. And then when they couldn't go back, they got stuck in a refugee camp. And it was to remain so for decades. They would be living, bringing up their children. Some of them would bring up their grandchildren as refugees in these camps. Israel actually offered to repatriate 100,000 of these refugees. But it was refused by the Arab nations of the world because the Arab nations of the world refused to acknowledge that the state of Israel exists. And so they wouldn't say, of course you can have them back, because they refused to have any dealings with the state of Israel at all. And so when you hear of the refugee crisis, CNN will cast it in a much different light. But know that they are biased in the opposite direction that I have already announced to you that I am giving. Okay? They are biased in the direction of the Arab League. I am biased in the direction of the Jewish people. So that's what we say of the refugee crisis. Now, let's bring it up into the 1956 Suez Crisis. I'm flying fast and low. If you have questions, I'd love to hear. Okay? Prior to 1956, Egypt had made noise about nationalizing the Suez Canal. Okay? There was a man in 1956 named Abdel Nasser. He was the president of Egypt. How many of you remember that name? Nasser? He was a troublemaker for quite a while. He nationalized the Suez Canal, meaning that Egypt took control of that little piece of waterway that connects the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. And so that's how they would get through from the Mediterranean down into the Arabian Gulf and then out into the Pacific Ocean. He sent Egyptian forces to block the Straits of Tiran, not Tehran, Tiran. Okay? The Straits of Tiran are down, you remember your map? They're right here. Okay? They're at the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba. Okay? And so Abdel Nasser said, I'm going to take the Suez Canal and I'm going to take the Straits of Tiran, which was the Jews' only way of getting commerce out. If we can't go through the Suez and we can't go through the Straits of Tiran, they're blocked. And so a blockade would destroy their commerce. Nasser had made some problems along these lines. He had actually allowed Palestinian terrorists to use Egypt as a base from which to attack Israel and then run back into before the Israelis could catch them. And so there was a very, you've heard of a love-hate relationship. This was just a hate-hate relationship. The Egyptians and the Israelis not getting along because terrorists were coming out of out of Egypt into Israel. On October 29th, 1956, Israeli troops invaded the Sinai Peninsula. Their goal was to reach the Suez and reopen Israeli trade. At the same time, British and French troops also acted to secure the area because they also didn't want Egypt to hold the Suez and close it off. So the French and the British attempted to form a buffer on both sides of the Suez Canal. A buffer, a no man's land between the Israeli army and the Egyptian army. That didn't work out real well. Egypt sought help from the Soviet Union, which threatened to intervene on behalf of the Egyptians against the Brits, the French, and the Israelis. So we had just come off of World War II that ended in 1945, and here in 1956, we're teetering on the edge of World War III, as the Soviet Union says, you better stop or we'll join with the Egyptians, and we'll come in, and so the Soviet Union tried to what's the word I'm looking for? They tried to inject themselves into the situation. President Eisenhower, at the time, he came in and tried to talk the Israelis down and tried to get them to stop so that we didn't go into World War III. The Sinai War lasted 1 week. Israel Britain and France withdrew their troops, and the Suez was open for business again. But it was a very, very tense time on the world stage. The aligning of the world powers, particularly the Soviets, backing the Egyptians, was to set a precedent. That's still a precedent today, in case you're following the news. Let's talk for just a moment about the Six-Day War. June 5th to June 10th, 1967. Once again, in 1967, there was talk amongst the Arab nations, specifically Egypt leading the talks about closing the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. Nasser again shut the straits and amassed troops on the southern border of Israel. The Syrians in the north were shelling Israel from the Golan Heights, and they increased the number of rockets all the time. They were sending down hundreds of rockets from the Golan Heights down onto the Jews who lived in Galilee. They were forced to live underground in bomb shelters for months at a time. Children would live in bomb shelters, wouldn't see the light of day for months at a time, because the Syrians kept shooting rockets down on them from the Golan Heights. Israel attacked in 3 different directions, a preemptive strike. They attacked in 3 different directions. They invaded the Gaza Strip, the southern portion. They invaded the Sinai, which they had held and returned after the 1956 Sinai War, led by a man who you should remember, Ariel Sharon. He was the 11th prime minister, and he passed away just very recently in 2006. So they invaded the Gaza Strip, they invaded the Sinai, and they invaded the Golan Heights. So a 3-front war: the Sinai, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights. Egypt was overwhelmed immediately in this war. Almost their entire air force was destroyed before it ever even got off the ground. The Israeli pilots came in, strafed their planes, and blew them up, and they weren't able to fight. So it wasn't going well. They sustained heavy losses, and Israel took control of the entire Sinai Peninsula real quick. Nasser phoned King Hussein of Jordan and told him a bald-faced lie. He called the king of Jordan and he said, "We're winning. We're beating the Israelis, and you should join us. If you don't join us, then you're going to be on the outs in our club amongst the Arab nations." And so King Hussein, operating on bad information, committed his troops. Okay? And so now you have the Jordanians fighting in the West Bank. So the Egyptians they're underwater in the Sinai. They're losing ground. They've lost their air force. Their navy is sinking. And so they get King Hussein to open a second front in the north, up along the Golan, where the Israelis were already fighting. On June 7th, Israel won control of the West Bank, which included Jerusalem. Moshe Dayan declared on the evening of June 7th that the Israelis would capture all of Jerusalem. He made a decision not to use tanks to do it because they didn't want to destroy the old city of Jerusalem. And so, led by Moshe Dayan, the Israeli army came in. They accomplished it on the evening of June 7th, 1967, for the first time since the intertestamental period. You remember that from our study previously? Jerusalem is now under Israeli control. The picture that you see here, maybe you've seen it before. This is some of the Israeli paratroopers, and behind them is the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall. The first time they've been able to get there in centuries. And it happened on June 7th. What happened in the Golan Heights? So in Sinai and in Gaza, the Egyptians were losing everything. When you go up into the Golan Heights, again, from 1948 until 1967, the Syrians had been launching missiles and rockets at the Israelis who lived in the valley. They were positioned in the Golan Heights. And on June 9th, 1967, the Israelis attacked the Golan Heights as part of the Northern Campaign. On the 10th, they captured the heights, and they held the ground from which they had been attacked for several decades, 19 years. The victory of the Israeli army was due largely to an Israeli spy named Eli Cohen. Eli Cohen was a phenomenal spy. He was born and raised in Egypt, and he joined the Mossad, which is the Israeli spy agency, the equivalent to our CIA. Cohen had gone undercover as a spy against the Syrians, and he was good at it. He made friends with very high-ranking individuals in the Syrian army. He was friends with generals and field marshals, and he was a very good spy. He moved to Damascus in 1962, so he was deep undercover. He also had an apartment in Argentina, and he would travel between Damascus and Argentina with the Syrian high command, and they would tell him all sorts of things about their plans. His cover was that he was a seller, an exporter, and importer of luxury furniture. So Eli Cohen was funneling information back to the Mossad. In 1964, Eli Cohen was given a guided tour of the Golan Heights. That's him in the middle there. He was given a guided tour of the Golan Heights and the Syrian defenses there. The defenses were designed by the Soviets, meaning they had pillboxes that faced the top of the mountain and the bottom of the mountain, because they assumed when the Israelis attempted to attack, they would paratroop down from the top, so they needed to have defenses going both ways. Eli Cohen walked around an Israeli spy led by the Syrian high command, and he was able to carry his sketchbook with him. And he sketched in where all of their defenses were, as he was led by the Syrian high command all over the Golan Heights. Guess what he did with his sketchbook? Sent it back to Israel. So when Israel attacked the Golan Heights in 1967, they knew exactly where everything was. There was no sneak attack. There was no weird angles that they had to face. Yes, sir?
They also donated palm trees that were put by every mortar installment, and so the Israelis knew that where a palm tree was there was a mortar installment. And
yep.
so, you know.
Yeah, he told them to plant a tree. He saw that their men were sitting out in the sun. It was hot, and so he said, if you plant this particular tree, you'll have lots of shade. So he sent back to Israel and said, every time you see one of these trees, there's a pillbox there, bomb the tree. And they did. And the Israelis mopped up. 2 days they took the Golan Heights that had been held by the Syrians for 19 years. That's saying something. Eli Cohen had free reign among the Syrian high command, so much so that on one occasion he was sitting in the office of one of the high command. The man was on the phone. He had classified documents sitting on his desk. Eli Cohen walked over and began to read the classified documents. When a different Syrian general walked in, he said, hey, what are you doing? The guy said, oh, he's a trusted friend. And he backed up Eli Cohen as being allowed to read classified documents of the Syrian army. The Soviets and the Syrians began to become suspicious, though information was leaking out of their countries. They narrowed it down to Eli Cohen. He had a radio set hid in the leg of a table there that he was sending information back to Israel. He was captured in mid-January 1965 in the middle of making a transmission. They walked in, caught him red-handed. He was imprisoned, given a show trial, and then hanged in the square of Damascus. And it was broadcast over Syrian television live. The Syrians were so angry over their being fooled, as they were, that they refused to return his body under any circumstances. The Israelis said that they would empty their prisons of Palestinian prisoners if they could get Eli Cohen back. The Syrians would not do that. The Israelis offered them tons of farm equipment for his body, and they wouldn't do that either. They were so angry over having been duped. And so he is buried in an unmarked grave near Damascus. But if you go to Israel, you'll see Eli Cohen boulevards and stuff all over the place, because they're said to be their greatest spy. When Israel took the Golan, it was primarily due to Eli Cohen, his bravery. They were able to take the high ground again. They'd been shelled from there for 19 years. They took it in 2 days. When the Six-Day War ended on June 10th, 1967, Israel controlled Jerusalem for the first time since between the Old and New Testaments. They controlled the West Bank, and they controlled the Golan Heights in the north. They controlled the Gaza Strip. They controlled the entire Sinai Peninsula up to the east bank of the Suez Canal. It is said that the only thing that stopped them from going to Cairo was public opinion. They were on a roll. They could have made it, but the nations of the world said, stop. Don't go any further. So Israel stopped. Occasionally you hear talk of the 1967 borders. This is what they looked like. Everything that's green and blue was owned by Israel. You remember how small it was when we started? Okay, they own just that little yellow patch. They own everything that's green, light green, teal, and blue. Their borders considerably expanded after 1967. That's where we're going to stop tonight. I tried to put more in, but I got to 8 pages and stopped. So I know kind of what that looks like in minutes. Do you have any questions here this evening? I hope it's an encouragement as you look at God's sovereignty. The nation of Israel is not a Christian nation. They don't serve Jesus Christ, but they're God's chosen people. And God said in Genesis chapter 12, those who bless you, I'll bless. Like Harry Truman and the United States. Those who curse you, I will curse. Like Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and so on. Yes?
So, is there a preferred religion in Israel, or is it just a...
Judaism.
Judaism?
Yeah,
Okay.
Judaism, although they're vastly a secular culture.
Okay.
They're primarily, probably, there are some nominal followers of Judaism, but there's actually a lot of Christians. There are a lot of Jews who are getting saved in Israel right now. They're getting saved in record numbers because they're turning to Messiah even now. Any other questions? How many of you remember any of this when it was making news the first time? Yep. Pretty neat, isn't it? I hope you're finding out a little bit more. They probably didn't tell you all of this on the news. Yes, sir.
So one more question. What is Zionism? Ain't that in Israel or something? What is that?
Zionism is the desire for the Jews to have a homeland.
Okay.
Yep. Anyone else? Question? Comment? Okay.
Well, there must have been a hiccup between Truman and the Jews, because I can remember when Eisenhower was elected, there was some talk among folks. I can still remember some conversation between folks at church on Sunday about how much better it was going to be for Israel now that Truman was in command.
Yeah. I don't know exactly what the hiccups were. As we all know, it's easy for someone who's really good to go to Washington, and they don't come out really good after 4 or 8 years. In the case of Truman, not quite 8 years, but yeah, it is
What was
fascinating.
the status of the Dome of the Rock and the temple at that time during
The Jews were highly
They took all that land and they owned that, and what was the status of that?
The Jews were highly respectful and still allowed the Arabs and the Muslims to use their holy sites. And they have all of this time. Truth be told, Israel's army is very powerful. Their air force is tremendous. Second, probably only to the United States, and some would argue that it's not second. They have tremendously dedicated. All of the young people in Israel are part of their army. They're all in reserve. Men and women are in the reserve army. Israel can call up 1 million troops in about 24 hours, which is really saying something. They're highly motivated, and the Israeli pilots are some of the best in the world, with some of the best technology in the world fighting. So if Israel wanted to clean off the Temple Mount, they could do it. But Israel, again, bound by public opinion and desiring to not see further bloodshed, has decided not to do that to date. Anyone else?
Israel and the United States are working together very closely right now.
Right now, thankfully. And I think God has blessed and will bless us because of it. Anyone else? All right. If you have any questions that come up, I'd love to talk with you. If I've muddied the waters, I'd love to help clear them. But there's lots and lots and lots more information. If you're interested in books on the subject, my wife would love for me to lend you some so that they can cut down on the count. But there are lots and lots of books on the subject and lots of fascinating stuff. Again, I told you before, I'm biased. I'm biased in the direction of Israel. That is not the way that most authors that you read are biased. And so just be aware of that. If you do pick up some books, know that they're probably coming at it from an Arab slant, or at least from a non-Israeli slant. So just be aware of that as you study. If you look online, you can find lots and lots of stuff, but know a little bit more. So, All right. Let's bow for a word of prayer, and then we'll be dismissed here this evening. Let's pray. Father, Lord, as we look at more recent history, and Lord, history that many in this room have lived through, it's awesome to see your hand. It's awesome to see that as a sovereign God, you're in control. That you know the end from the beginning, Lord, that you were able to use such small forces to turn such large forces back. Lord, we pray for the peace of Jerusalem even tonight. Lord, I pray that more of your chosen people would understand and would accept the Messiah who's already come. Lord, I pray that there would be those who would go and who would speak to the Jewish people on behalf of Jesus Christ, and that they would trust him. Lord, I pray that you would bless the United States as we have blessed Israel. Lord, we thank you for that. Lord, we thank you for the current administration who does seek to honor Israel. Lord, I pray that you would bless, just continue to bless because of it. We know that you have. Lord, I pray that you'd help us to take these stories and these different historical accounts, and I pray that you would use them to build our faith. Pray that we would be able to trust our problems to you, knowing that you've solved bigger problems in the past. And we thank you for your goodness, your love for us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.